What if liberalism isn't failing because it's broken, but because the world it was designed to fit has quietly disappeared underneath it? Not the philosophy changing, but the conditions, the rival environment, the people themselves. And here's the uncomfortable part. Liberalism's own universalism prevents it from doing anything about either. I ended the last video by saying that liberalism doesn't work for all people, at all times, in all places. And that's not a moral claim, it's an engineering observation. A town of 1,000 people in Mesopotamia in 5000 BC, scratching a living from the mud, has no use for a parliament that pulls labourers off the land. Their problems are different. How do we stop the monarch next door from conquering us? Not how do we manage a 1,000,000-person society. And that example works in both directions. Just as you can't impose a philosophy on a society that hasn't evolved to the point the philosophy assumes, which is why the Soviet Union failed, which is why the French Revolution needed 3 attempts and hundreds of thousands of lives. You also can't change the society operating underneath a philosophy and expect the philosophy to go on working as though nothing happened. Britain in Locke's own era was an unusually liberal-minded people already for the time. Individualist, property conscious, comfortable with formal contract even inside the family. Skeptical of unaccountable power for centuries before Locke gave that skepticism philosophical shape. The question is that still an accurate description of Great Britain today? Let's start with the rival environment. Liberalism's own historical proliferation leaned heavily on liberal societies simply outcompeting illiberal rivals, economically, militarily, or both. The more obvious challenge today is that liberalism's own success has diluted that comparative advantage. Others have adopted it. Others still have identified ways to succeed in a world dominated by societies wielding liberal tools without adopting the same constraints. China, for example, has managed rapid growth and a rapid rise toward genuine superpower status, whilst only selectively helping itself to component tools of liberalism, and deliberately declining most of the defining constraints. There's no meaningfully independent judiciary, there's no real free press, there's no electoral mechanism capable of removing the state's own leadership against its will. Of course, many of us would say some of this sounds like Britain today as well. But when one of your most consequential rivals has found ways to capture several of the benefits of liberalism, whilst avoiding several of its costs, is the trade still as clearly favourable as it was when liberalism was proliferating against slower, poorer, more brittle, monarchical autocracies a century ago? Now, the less considered challenge is a bit closer to home. Liberalism worked for Britain when Britain was the top global power. But now America occupies that position. Within that context, is full liberalism still the ideal cultural tool for us? Or are we even talking about the same liberalism? But the rival environment is the easier extrinsic problem to discuss. The harder one, considerably harder, is the people in Britain themselves. Liberal institutions were built on a specific set of assumptions about the people running them. Individuals who accept losing an election, who trust an impersonal court over a personal patron, who extend the same rule-following behaviour to strangers they'll never meet. As I briefly touched on in an earlier piece, Britain, driven by the church, gradually shifted away from tribe and kinship ties over the 800 years leading up to Locke, and this created a population capable of sustaining liberal institutions in the first place. If you swap out a meaningful share of the population operating those institutions for people organised at the level that actually governs their behaviour around tribal or kinship loyalty instead, institutions don't necessarily break in any dramatic visible way, they just stop being used the way they're designed to be used. Take democracy. Sectarianism in its purest form means elections stop functioning as a contest of ideas and start functioning as a headcount of tribal blocks, each voting for its own regardless of policy, because policy was never the thing being represented in the first place. This pattern has no shortage of real-world precedent, from British India's own partition to more recent sectarian breakdowns throughout the world. And here's where the intrinsic and extrinsic sides of this argument connect directly, because they're not just a coincidence. Liberalism's own universalism, the first intrinsic factor, is exactly what removes any principled basis for insisting new arrivals set aside a prior tribal or kinship loyalty in favour of a new national one. A tool that cannot privilege the in-group over the out-group has no consistent grounds left to ask any immigrant to privilege their new British in-group over their own prior in-group. And asking for that kind of assimilation starts to look, on liberalism's own terms, like asking someone to abandon a legitimate identity for an arbitrary one. So the retention gets tolerated, then normalised, then in some places actively accommodated. not through malice or carelessness, but because liberalism's own logic doesn't have a principled way to ask about anything else. The dissolving group boundary is directly leading to the changing composition of the people running British institutions. The intrinsic and extrinsic aren't separate problems operating parallel, one is driving the other. So, intrinsically, universalism dissolving the group, accountability ossified into paralysis. Extrinsically, a changing field of rivals willing to capture liberalism's benefits while skipping its costs, and a people who may not be the people the tool was originally built to fit. The two halves connect at the point where liberalism's universalism prevents us from doing anything about the changing population underneath it. Now, there's one big piece that's still missing from this. If you want to find out what that is, please like and subscribe, and watch out for the next video. And for the comments, can a political system survive if it can't ask newcomers to adopt the cultural assumptions the system itself was based on?